So today we're going to spend some time talking about Supplier Portal. So what is Supplier Portal? Well, Supplier Portal gives your suppliers access to the Infor system. It's typically used in conjunction with strategic sourcing and the contract management modules. Your suppliers will be able to log into their personal account after they have registered. So first they would register in your Supplier Portal. They could manage their information, review events, or respond to bids that you have submitted through Supplier Portal. And additionally, they can view information about the various things below. So purchase orders, any receipts, invoices, payments. They have the ability to create item proposals and send in recall information. And everything that your supplier sees is going to be a result of how you set up your Supplier Group system. So we're going to take a look at that in just a moment. But we're going to start right now with my number one top tip and trick. And so you'll see it says start early. And so what I mean by that is that it's very important to establish, a strong communication plan early on in any project with those that it would impact. So in this instance, establishing or creating and using Supplier Portal will impact your suppliers and how they do business with you. And so if your organization is implementing Supplier Portal or doing any enhancements through Supplier Portal, maybe rolling in the strategic sourcing module or something to that effect, it's helpful for both you and your suppliers to keep that line of communication open. So suggesting that, maybe you have a representative in your organization that is their point of contact. So if they have questions throughout the course of the project, they have somebody to reach out to. Another thing in regards to starting off your project early is incorporate all of your departments into your design decisions. The slide previously talked about some of the abilities to view, and so Supplier Portal does have the capability and some AP functionality, like I mentioned previously, to submit invoices. And so including your AP department in those design discussions is just going to help to make sure that everybody's needs are met. Their department needs are met as well as yours, and it's just going to make for a smoother process overall. It's helpful to identify the training needs. So this can kind of go in conjunction with providing your suppliers with maybe an FAQ document or a job aid before and after go live, having something, giving them something that they can have that's tangible to refer back to. Again, because implementing or utilizing Supplier Portal will change the way in which they interact with you in the system. And if you're considering doing a Supplier Portal implementation project, it's helpful to pre-register your suppliers before go live. So there really would be, no need to kind of wait until that go live date. You could collect their information, get them into the system, do any troubleshooting ahead of time, just so they feel comfortable with navigating through Supplier Portal and accessing its various pieces of information. That's tip and trick number one, is start early. Tip number two, I would say less is more. So in some cases, you think the more information, the better. And while that is true, setting up your system to be clear and concise for both you and your suppliers is going to be the best bet. So have those thoughtful design discussions when you're setting up your supplier grouping, because again, I can't stress it enough, it's going to be what your suppliers see when they log into the system. Determine what information and details you might be able to provide to your suppliers. For example, commonly used documents. If your organization requires your suppliers to supply them with a W-9, maybe provide that for your suppliers at the registration level so they can complete that W-9, send it in or get sent in when they register, and then you have it for future reference. So that's always helpful to be able to provide them with the information that you're looking for. Additionally, commonly used links. And so what I mean by that is, maybe you want to provide them with the link to access that W-9. Supplier Group Setup has the ability to do that. Additionally, we've worked with clients in the past that, they require their suppliers to register with the state in which they're doing business in. So maybe provide them with that link as well in case they haven't registered with that entity. You can help them to get there. And then limiting or consider limiting your registration questions. Questions can be a really helpful tool for your organization to get as much information as you need from the supplier up front to help with that registration and validation process. But again, maybe taking into account what is it that AP needs, what is it that procurement needs, and combining those needs together to implement and I outline those registration questions. So your supplier group. Your supplier group contains several different sections that you see here on the slide that are comprised with details and information for your suppliers and what they're going to see and encounter during the registration process. So we're going to jump over to Cloud Suite, and you'll see that I am in Cloud Suite right now. I'm in the application administrator role, and so your supplier group setup is within supply management. It's within supply management setup and supplier group. So your supplier group setup, again, is going to be what drives your supplier portal and the information that is required for your suppliers to fill out. On your general area, it's going to look for specific information about, do you want to allow duplicate tax information? What's your commodity registration level? So there's a lot of details here that are covered in this general section. There is the option to do a validation process. So you can have your suppliers register and require validation for those suppliers, which would then indicate somebody in your organization would need to review that supplier registration record before actually validating them as a supplier. You have the ability to enter terms and conditions. So when your suppliers go to register, they see this up front. Primarily as soon as they log in and access the system, which we'll also take a look at in a few moments. You can allow banking information. So again, thinking about if there's an exchange and utilizing of that AP functionality, this is something that you're going to want to consider. And then we mentioned previously that the supplier portal also ties in with strategic sourcing. So you'll see here that there's some event processing options. So different things about bid tabulation, things like that. Like, what do you want the suppliers to see after maybe they've been awarded and responded to an event? There's some vendor location defaulting, so you can set up specific defaults. And then we'll take a little bit look later into vendor credentialing, but Cloud Suite does allow suppliers to utilize VendorMate to help with that vendor credentialing process. Additionally, within your supplier group setup, there are certain aspects that you can help to drive any subcontractor setup, again, allowing duplicate tax IDs or different process options. And then a moment ago, we spoke about questions. Questions, again, are a really helpful tool to help you collect the information that you're looking for from your suppliers. So in our sandbox, we have it limited, I believe, just to these 5 questions. But when you're creating a question, you have the ability to create the question text that you like. You have the ability to select your response type. So if you are specifically looking for, maybe your question is, when was your organization founded? And you want just the date, you can have that be your response type. Additionally, with that, you can allow attachments to be uploaded with your supplier answers. So if you're looking for specific insurance certifications from your suppliers, and maybe that's one of your questions, allowing for attachments will give them the opportunity to provide that documentation in the registration process. And then additionally, we spoke a lot about the W-9s. That's something that's important for organizations. If your question says, please provide your W-9, and you can provide them with an attachment to that document as well. So if there's something that you want to provide to your supplier throughout the question section, you can provide that attachment as well. Once you have your questions listed here in your repository, maybe over the course of time, those questions aren't applicable to your organization anymore, or they have changed a little bit, you have the ability to activate or inactivate that information. Within your supplier group, there's specific registration text that your suppliers will see when they get to that information. So thinking about, how do you want the supplier to be directed to select their diversity codes? Keep it straightforward and simple, or you can elaborate a little bit more. There is some message configuration options. And so this is helpful too if you utilize the supplier validation. That individual will get an email who you have here listed internally, okay, that says, hey, you need to validate the supplier. And then this is the supplier registration acknowledgement section. So once their registration is successful and complete, it will send them a message as well back that their file or their record is established. Additionally, you have the ability to provide portal contacts. So just as any website would have a contact us, Supplier Portal has a contact us section, and this is where you would determine if your supplier has a question, who is it that they're going to reach out to? You can provide their name, maybe just email address, name, email, and phone number, all of the above, and that will really help to facilitate those questions that your suppliers may have. Earlier, we talked about providing your suppliers with links and instructions. So in our example here, we've got a few different portal links to access a W-9 via the IRS government website, and then just a sample of a various website as well. So you can list out your instructions and provide the link to the location or the link to where you want your suppliers to retrieve a document. And then this section here, again, this is where that AP functionality comes into place. So you have invoice creation text through your supplier created invoices. There's various supplier portal access setup that you can select as well. So as it pertains to strategic sourcing, contract management, supplier order management, you can indicate if you want just your primary contact who is registered as your supplier to be able to view or respond to that detail or information, or if you want other contacts as well. And then there's just some miscellaneous information down here. We mentioned on the first slide that the supplier portal allows suppliers to create item proposals or create recall notices, and that would be driven by your miscellaneous setup. And then lastly on your supplier group setting is this anonymous portal access. Do you want individuals who maybe have access to your supplier portal link as an anonymous user to see your events or your contracts, or do you not? Maybe you just don't want them to see anything at all, or maybe you just want those individuals to be able to search your events. This setup here is going to help you to drive that detail. Okay. So tip number 3, become familiar with the supplier portal system. And frequently we're asked, what's the difference between a vendor and a supplier? So for those who maybe aren't familiar with strategic sourcing or a supplier portal, it's important to know that prior to doing business with your organization, we're looking for hopeful vendors or potential vendors to register, but a supplier doesn't necessarily mean they're doing business with your organization just yet. So in this case, when you're registering through the supplier portal, or your suppliers are, they're interested in establishing a relationship with your organization. They're interested in reviewing and responding to bidding events, but they haven't yet been validated or approved or awarded an event to then become a vendor. Test out your supplier portal. Once you've created your setup through that supplier grouping, run through the test environment of your supplier portal. Does it make sense? Are there things that are confusing? So taking off your organizational hat and putting on your supplier hat and trying to look through it through the lens of a supplier, you really want to make sure that the setup that you have established in your supplier group really makes sense. And then you can identify, are there any gaps? Maybe there's some questions that just don't quite make sense. Or maybe there are questions that you neglected to add that are really important to your business process or your organization. Getting in the system, becoming familiar with what the supplier sees is going to help to establish that information. And then lastly, is there anything in the setup that can help to enhance the supplier experience? So again, are there any documents that you can attach within your questions? Are there portal links that you want your suppliers to access? Really kind of thinking outside the box in that regard. Maybe you want your suppliers to, utilize EFT. So maybe you're going to provide them with the documentation that you require as an organization to be able to establish that. So your supplier portal, and we're going to jump in just a moment, but the supplier registration uses a wizard to help guide your suppliers through the process. So this is where your supplier is going to complete that required information that you have established within that supplier group setup. We're going to jump now. So here I am in our RPI Consultants Dev environment for Cloud Suite within my specific supplier group here, and I am just in as anonymous. So if you remember during our setup, we had to display events. So as an anonymous user, I can retrieve different events and I can browse those open events. Again, as somebody that's anonymous, I have not yet registered, or I can search for specific events. If that individual, they wouldn't necessarily be able to respond, but they could see the information that's out there. And then so part of becoming familiar with the system is really kind of saying, okay, what has to happen when they register? And so you would click on register. And again, it takes you to the wizard, or at least it's thinking about it. And it's going to walk you through all of the various areas in order to be able to set up your supplier record. So for the sake of time, I'm actually going to sign into a supplier record that I've already established. So I click sign in down below. And hopefully I wrote it down correctly. Excellent. So now I have logged into my specific supplier information, my specific account. So I can see from here, I would be able to browse open events, search those events, look to see any of the responses that I've submitted as a supplier. If I had any contracts with your organization, I would be able to see that information here as well. Again, with any sort of order management or, excuse me, recall information, new item proposals, I can access that information here. So your suppliers are looking at a system that's very similar to what you work in every day within Cloud Suite. And now let's say I needed to review some of my account details. I can look at that specific account information that I've established as a supplier, and I can go ahead and I can make changes or updates to that information. And so all of those sections that we looked at as part of the registration process from the supplier are listed down on the left-hand side here. And so one of the pieces of information that we're frequently asked is, can you have multiple contacts on a supplier account? So you can establish additional contacts here where you could create a new contact and identify whether or not you want that individual to receive notifications. And that specific contact also goes through their registration process as far as what you see within Cloud Suite. Maybe I'm an organization that now has a new certification that I want to add to my information or to my profile. I can establish that here as well. Maybe I want to register for a new commodity code. Again, all of your account information can be updated and changed from this location here. Another big one is, your supplier contact, they're going out of town, they're going on vacation, but you still want to be able to receive information about upcoming bids or any sort of notifications about a bid that you've responded to. You have, or your suppliers have, the option to set up a proxy notification, which is really helpful. So similarly to within Cloud Suite, with whether it be a requisition center or something like that, your approvers, they have the ability to set up proxy notifications. So do your suppliers. So it's pretty straightforward to navigate from a supplier standpoint. We'll look at real quick those links and instructions. We took a look at information on our supplier group setup, how we had a link to access our W-9, and that information is here. And then lastly, that contact us section, that's super important when you're establishing any sort of relationship with a supplier. You want to be able to provide them with somebody to contact in the event that they have questions or they want to troubleshoot. That information is here as well. So all of that is kept within the supplier account information, as well as within that role for the supplier, pretty easily accessible. Okay. So number 4 tip and trick is if you are utilizing Supplier Portal in conjunction with strategic sourcing, you have the option to allow for question and answers. So if your supplier is responding to an event that you have published through the Supplier Portal and you allow for question and answers, it's going to help to encourage communication between your organization and your suppliers. It's going to provide them with an opportunity to ask clarifying questions about the event, whether it's about a specific request in your event or anything of that nature. They would be able to respond through the Supplier Portal. You would see that question within strategic sourcing, and you would be able to answer it through strategic sourcing as well. And so your answers entered in Cloud Suite would then transmit back to your suppliers through Supplier Portal. So highly recommend you utilize that if you're using strategic sourcing, but also respond to those questions in a timely manner. So those questions might provoke additional questions from your suppliers. And so when you're answering them timely, you make sure that everyone has the opportunity to get clarification about your event so they can respond in the best way that they can. And then when you are in strategic sourcing and you're creating your event and you're responding to that question, maybe that your supplier has submitted in regards to that event, you have the ability to enable the Q&A view to all suppliers or just to the one that submitted the question. I would recommend if you're going to return that question with an answer that you make it accessible and visible to all suppliers, because most likely there are additionals that also have that same question. So it seems pretty straightforward, but until you get into play and really see how Supplier Portal interacts with that, it's just helpful to keep that information in mind. And then lastly, we spoke about a vendor-mate credentialing. So just briefly, just because we're cutting down a little bit on time, vendor-mate credentialing is a third-party vendor credentialing system. It is geared towards the healthcare industry, but it does help to track and screen suppliers in a centralized database. And so that's an option when you're setting up your supplier grouping if your suppliers want to use vendor-mate credentialing. It can just help to expedite that process and limit the amount of validation that your team or that your organization would have to do for that supplier. So I just wanted to take a moment. We have a few minutes left in today's discussion just to see if there were any questions that I might be able to assist with today, or any, any questions that we can address. Okay, I have one here that says, after an event is analyzed and awarded, can we use the details from the sourcing event to create a contract? So while this discussion didn't really go too much into sourcing and contract management, I want to make sure to answer, absolutely. When you create an event and your event is awarded, you determine what the output of that event is. So it can be a purchase order output, or it can be a contract output, and that information is collected from the event, so details that you have entered for your supplier, their responses back to that event, and is converted into one of those two outputs. Okay. Let's see. One more question of what types of links do you find most clients in the portal prefer? And just kind of, again, going back, most of the clients that I've worked with in the past, if not all that are utilizing Supplier Portal, they really use that W-9 is huge. We've worked with organizations before where sometimes that information is difficult to collect after the fact. So requesting that information up front is definitely going to be your best option. And again, maybe even taking it a step further to provide your suppliers with the link to access the W-9 form or provide it right there in your questions themselves.